Welcome to our webinar on how to engage your team in quality candidate feedback in Recruiterbox. I'm Annette with Recruiterbox Support, and I wanted to thank you for joining me today. Today, we're going to discuss meaningful candidate feedback and the importance of gathering it. I'll also go over how to gather this kind of feedback in Recruiterbox using our custom interview and review evaluation forms. And finally, I'm going to share some pro tips from myself and the rest of our support team on how to best set up your evaluation forms in order to gather meaningful feedback. First, let's talk about feedback on a candidate and what it's all about. Feedback is the thoughts, opinions, and recommendations from others that can help you determine what to do with a candidate. Feedback can help you figure out if you should move a candidate to the next stage, schedule a follow-up interview, reject or put them on hold, or make them an offer and hire them. Now, when should you gather feedback? Anytime, really. I know most people think feedback should come toward the end of the hiring process as you're deciding whether or not to hire someone, but Recruiterbox believes otherwise. This is why we allow you to gather feedback on a candidate at any point in the hiring process. Some examples of when to gather feedback are during the initial screening process, like when you've just received an application and need a teammate's feedback on whether to move a candidate forward, after the first or even final interview to see how things went, right before an offer is made, like maybe you need to get your CEO's final thumbs up before proceeding, or again, anytime, anywhere in between these steps. So why does feedback matter? And why should you care, particularly if you're the ultimate decision maker? Even if you don't need anyone else's approval to hire or reject a candidate, it can benefit you to involve other teammates in the feedback process. Doing so can get buy-in for a new teammate, encourage participation in training the new teammate, and remind everyone that they have a voice and that their opinions matter. This is just good for overall team morale. All right, so now let's talk about how to do this all in Recruiterbox. You can ask teammates for their feedback by inviting them to either interviews or reviews. Every time you do this, they will be prompted to fill out an evaluation form, like the one you see on your screen. This is the default form, and it allows your teammates to type in their open-ended comments and thoughts. They can attach files if needed, and of course, pick a thumbs up, down, or neutral rating to note their overall recommendation. That said, when you use the default form, you give your teammates the freedom to express their feedback without restrictions. This can be a good or bad thing. To demonstrate this, let's look at feedback from 3 different interviewers who sat in on the same in-person interview with a candidate. First up, we have an interviewer who gave a single thumbs up and the comment, "I like this candidate." So what do you guys think of this feedback? It seems pretty clear, or maybe not. Here are a few follow-up questions I'd have for this interviewer. First, it looks like you want to move them forward, but why? Do you like them for the job or just in general as a person? What do you like about this candidate? And what was your rating based on? I bet you guys can think of even more questions. So let's look at another feedback form for the same candidate. So this next interviewer gave a neutral rating and the comment, "Candidate lacked communication skills." Great, that's pretty specific, I think. But here are my follow-up questions for this person. 1, are communication skills a requirement for this job? How did you assess this candidate's skill set? And does your neutral rating imply they should still be in the running for this job even if they're not the best? Lastly, we have an interviewer who gave a double thumbs down and said, "Candidate stuttered and avoided eye contact during the interview. We need someone who can speak with customers comfortably." Okay, well, I don't have any follow-up questions for this person. This interviewer's feedback makes it clear that this candidate lacks the job requirements and that they are a definite no for moving forward. This is what we call meaningful and actionable feedback. So, what do I mean by meaningful feedback? Meaningful feedback is clear, specific, and doesn't require much if any, follow-up to understand what was meant. This includes feedback that doesn't just give a candidate a rating, but includes information for why or how that rating was determined. Meaningful feedback in Recruiterbox is actionable. So how do you gather this feedback? Well, you can hope your interviewers and reviewers know exactly what feedback you need, like the person who submitted that third feedback form. Or you can guide them by providing evaluation forms that specifically collect the information you're looking for. To help with this, Recruiterbox has structured evaluation forms. Structured evaluation forms can help you gather meaningful and actionable feedback because they let you ask teammates to evaluate specific qualities and attributes in addition to giving an open-ended overall recommendation. You can also use this space to note questions you need teammates to provide answers to, which might include questions to ask during the interview or just questions to be thinking about when evaluating the candidate. Now let's talk about how to set these up. Evaluation forms can be set up when creating or editing any interview or review stage. Click the Setup Evaluation Form link to get started. The forms you create for a stage then become the default forms for interviews and reviews created within those stages. You can also set up evaluation forms ad hoc when scheduling individual interviews or sending individual candidates for review. Whenever you create these individual items, you'll notice an Edit Evaluation Form link. Click this to customize the evaluation form for just that interview or review. This is super helpful if you need to get feedback on a candidate outside of an interview or review stage, or you want to get very specific feedback from a certain person. Now, when setting up the evaluation form, you'll start by clicking Add an Attribute or Quality and enter in your attribute or even interview question. You'll see a field for the attribute itself and an additional optional field to enter details that will help your teammates understand more about that attribute. Click the blue Add Attribute button when you're done. Continue to add attributes and qualities or interview questions until you're satisfied with the form. We will always append an overall recommendation question at the end. This question cannot be removed, and as you saw in the default form, this question will show up on forms if you choose not to customize or add your own attributes or questions. When you're done, click Preview Form to view what the finished form will look like for your interviewers and reviewers. By the way, even though each line has a rating, interviewers and reviewers are not required to choose a rating outside of the overall recommendation question. So if choosing a rating doesn't make sense, like if you ask someone how many years of experience the candidate has, they can just enter their answer as a note and not choose a rating. Okay, now here's a pro tip. Click the Copy Evaluation Form button to copy an existing form from another stage, even if it's part of a different opening. This will save you time as you won't need to type the same things over and over again. You can always edit the form once it's copied, so feel free to find an existing form that's close to what you need. Then just add, edit, or remove attributes and questions so that the current form meets your current needs. Now, while we're on the topic of pro tips, I've got a few more for you. First, list all attributes or qualities your teammates should be assessing depending on the specific opening and stage a candidate is in. Keep in mind that different openings, interviews, and reviews might call for different assessments. For example, when a candidate first submits an application and is in the screening stage, you might have teammates conduct phone interviews just to check whether or not a candidate is simply employable. So the feedback form might have a couple simple eligibility questions. Now, later in the hiring process though, let's say when a candidate makes it to the make offer stage, you might ask a reviewer for feedback to determine whether this is the best candidate you have for this role. The questions in this stage may be more in-depth and their answers will likely have more weight than the ones you asked in the screening stage. Next, I want you to think of the structured evaluation form as a standard assessment list. This should encourage fair and consistent interviewing and reviewing in two ways. First, all candidates will be assessed using the same rubric, rather than just what an interviewer or reviewer might think or remember to assess. Second, all interviewers and reviewers will be assessing the same attributes and answering the same questions, so feedback should be easy to compare against one another. For example, with a structured evaluation form, you might ask interviewers to always assess a candidate's communication skills. If you don't ask about this on the form, teammates may not always assess for it during interviews. So when it comes time to choose who to move forward, some totally eligible candidates may get passed over because feedback on that required skill wasn't recorded. This might lead someone to assume that a candidate doesn't possess that skill. But what if they do possess it? What if they're the best communicator in the world, but someone just didn't make note of it? A bit unfair, don't you think? You can avoid this very scenario by using our structured evaluation forms. Okay, so earlier I mentioned that when you add an attribute, there's an optional field to enter details that will help your teammates understand more about that attribute. I say optional because it is, but I actually recommend regularly using that field to clarify what an attribute means, particularly if the attribute itself might be a vague descriptor. After all, what does communication skills even mean? Written, verbal, something else? Use that optional field to clarify what each attribute means in relation to the job, so teammates can understand what exactly they should be assessing and why. In this example, the attribute is a vague communication skills. So we help our teammates out by also mentioning that they should focus on verbal or conversational skills, since we're hiring for a person who will be interacting with customers face to face. We need someone who is well-spoken and can carry on a conversation. To add to that last pro tip, another way to clarify what an attribute means is by including suggested questions that may help your teammates assess for a specific quality or attribute. For example, the attribute I've listed here is comfortableness interacting with customers. While it's pretty clear what that means, how does one assess for this without actually seeing a candidate with an actual customer? And you don't want to just ask the candidate, do you feel comfortable interacting with customers? Because frankly, they'll probably say yes if they know it's part of the job. Rather, asking the candidate the following questions could give you insight into this attribute. For example, do you feel comfortable starting conversations with strangers? And how are you with answering a lot of questions on the spot? For that last one, you may not even ask the candidate the question, but perhaps the interviewer could keep this in mind and assess how the candidate did when answering a lot of interview questions on the spot. These questions can serve as a springboard for interviewers and reviewers to come up with their own questions to ask candidates. Speaking of interview questions, if you have questions you definitely need interviewers to collect answers to, list those. Add required or something similar to signal to interviewers that this is not a suggested question, but rather a required one to get an answer on. Now, the last two pro tips I have are to help your interviewers and reviewers, which in turn helps you. First, you can add an unlimited number of qualities and attributes in questions, but be mindful of the length of the final form. Once you've created your form, I suggest creating an interview with a test candidate, inviting yourself as the interviewer, then filling out the form yourself. How did it feel? Was it too long, confusing, or did it feel like a breeze? Make sure that you're not asking too much of your teammates. Trust me, your teammates will thank you for not giving them more work than even you'd be willing to do. Additionally, if there are too many fields to fill out, your teammates might provide less and less meaningful feedback toward the end as they're just trying to finish the form, and that's not helpful to anyone. Lastly, educate your teammates on the importance of their feedback and how to fill out their evaluation forms. If you'll be using any of today's pro tips, such as adding suggested versus required questions, or questions that don't require ratings, conduct a quick training session with your team so that they understand what they should be doing. Okay, so just to recap, today we went over meaningful candidate feedback and the importance of gathering it, how to set up evaluation forms to gather this feedback, and pro tips for utilizing structured evaluation forms.